Okay, so this is our last lecture for this module, and it's about Chapter 24 in the Great Depression. And so I've got this one split into 3 lectures. So the first one is going to deal with the onset of the Great Depression, the stock market crash, and then Hoover's response to it, and we'll end with the election of 1932. The second part is going to deal with the New Deal and the actual sort of political and legislative kind of wrangling that goes on within the New Deal. And then the last lecture is going to deal with society, the social impact of the Depression, and how American culture was changed or affected by this period. So this first section is going to deal with the onset of the Depression and Hoover's response to it, and we'll go ahead and get started. So the Wall Street crash, and the problems that underlay it launched the Great Depression, and it hit every household in America, and it also hit globally. People around the world were suffering from the Depression. And the causes of the Depression are very firmly to be seen in the kind of economic excesses that defined the previous decade, the 1920s, as we sort of discussed in class. The stock prices had been on the rise through much of the 1920s, but in 1928 and early in 1929, you see a massive upswing with speculators diving into the market and driving the prices up. By October of 1929, the stock market had hit $87 billion. Stockbrokers were lending buyers up to 75% of the stock's cost on credit, so they're buying a lot of these on credit, not with actual money, and that poses a huge problem. The income tax cuts that were promoted by the Treasury under Presidents Harding and Coolidge also increased the flow of money into the market and helped to drive those prices up. You also have various upbeat statements coming from people in the government, from the president to the secretary of the Treasury to members of Congress, all talking about how America's economy is on a permanent upswing and it's nothing but blue skies and everything ahead for us. And all of that is increasing consumer confidence, and so again driving these prices, the speculation, up. The construction industry, however, was faltering. In 1928 and 1929, they start a noticeable decline in the housing market, as well as business expansion, which was kind of what was happening in 2008 as well. The Federal Reserve Board attempted to try and kind of halt this speculative fever by raising the interest rates and urging their member banks to restrain their lending, but those banks refused to do so. They continued to loan money freely until finally on October 24th, which is known as Black Thursday, the collapse came. Prices fell. Some stocks couldn't find buyers at all, and a lot of them had become just worthless, simply. And over the next few weeks, you have some attempts at kind of upswings, but ultimately it falls even more before finally sort of just going into a full tailspin. After a kind of weak upswing in 1930, it just descends into a full and a long tailspin, producing the full-on depression that we get at the beginning of that decade. Economists who were sort of looking at the underlying causes focused a lot on structural problems that made the 1920s prosperity very unstable. Agriculture remained depressed all through the 1920s. And as I mentioned in class, that's the same sort of thing that leads to the collapse of the Soviet economy or after the 1980s or in the 1980s, because agriculture was constantly depressed. Even though industry was growing in the Soviet Union, agriculture was depressed, and that imbalance ultimately threw off the stability of the economic system. And it's the same thing that we see happening in the 1920s, and it results in the Great Depression. Wage increases also lagged far behind factory output as far as the industrial sector was concerned, which reduced consumer purchasing power, and so, as I mentioned before, consumption was going down. And it was only a matter of time, really, before it sort of hit critical mass. The assembly line methods were also encouraging overproduction by corporations. So even though people weren't buying up the products, they were still producing at the same rate. And that left with a lot of surplus that wasn't being sold. By the summer of 1929, not only the housing, but also big industries like automobile, textile, rubber, all of these were seriously overextended. And other key industries like railroads and steel and textiles, the big ones that created our industrial prosperity in the late 19th century, they are all lagging behind, technologically speaking, and not attracting any kind of new investment, which is also creating issues of instability within the economy of the 1920s. Some economists also blame the Federal Reserve System's tight money policies in the 1930s, but this is much more debated generally as a cause. All analysts link the U.S. Depression to a global economic crisis, and a lot of that stems from the money problems that came out of the First World War. So if you recall, at the end of chapter 23, when we discussed the Versailles Treaty, there was something like $33 billion worth of reparations payments that were being essentially forced on Germany. The United States was insisting that our allies pay back their loans that they took from the United States with interest. Those countries weren't willing to pay back those loans unless they got reparations payments from Germany. The U.S. was propping up Germany's economy by loaning Germany money. So essentially we were loaning money to ourselves because we gave money to Germany. Germany used it to pay the reparations, and then the Allies used it to pay their loans back. The U.S. probably could have broken this cycle by forgiving their debts to the Allies altogether, but we refused to do that. And that essentially lends this an air of sort of global crisis, because when the U.S. stops loaning money to Germany in the 1930s, Germany defaults on their reparations payments, the Allies default on their loan payments, and the whole sort of global economy gets wrapped up in this depression. And it really hurts the U.S. export market. If you remember when we talked about Keynesian economics, that there is equal parts, these 4 parts: consumption, government purchases, business investment, and foreign exports. Consumption is contracted, business investment is contracted, and exports are contracted, which means that all those things have diminished, and it leads to an imbalance in the economy, which is ultimately the Depression. As far as Hoover's response, it had a tendency to flow in kind of the way that Americans had always responded to depressions. Historically, Americans had viewed them as kind of like natural disasters, that there was very little that could be done other than to just ride them out. And as I mentioned in class, the only problem with this theory is that this depression was so much more serious than our previous ones that there was a very high human cost to just riding out the depression. And so Hoover wasn't completely willing to do that. But again, his ideology kind of got in the way. His ideology was focused on sort of individual altruism, that people would voluntarily make decisions that would be for the greater good of the community at large. And it's somewhat of an overestimation of people's generosity. But under this sort of ideology, under these auspices, Hoover didn't want sort of federal relief programs and things like that. He feared that it would create a kind of welfare state. And so he urged city and state officials to create public work projects within their state, so make it a local initiative, essentially. He set up an emergency committee for employment to coordinate these voluntary relief efforts. He persuaded the nation's banks to create private lending agencies to help smaller banks. But despite all these initiatives, public opinion is turning sour because it's not actually doing anything to help the individual people who are standing in the bread lines or trying to get unemployment or living in the Hoovervilles. These are aimed mainly at businesses, at banks and places like that, which is well and good because those are the kind of the sources of the problems, but it doesn't help the individual who can't find dinner. And that's where public opinion starts to turn against Hoover. Republicans in the 1930 midterm election lost the House of Representatives. They gave up 8 seats in the Senate, and dreading the idea of a budget deficit, Hoover calls for increased taxes, which really only makes the situation worse. In 1932, which is a presidential election year, Hoover kind of swallows his principles and takes some more bold action coming from the federal government rather than urging state relief. He sets up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which would directly make loans to banks and other lending institutions from the federal government. He supported these measures only reluctantly because he felt that they could lead to what he called socialism and collectivism, and he mainly blamed global forces for the Depression. And he argued that only international measures would help. And this is quite possibly true. It's a very valid argument that global measures definitely didn't make the Depression any better, and then definitely made it worse. But while it makes sense, it also seemed irrelevant to the plight of a lot of ordinary Americans who wanted actual proper help for themselves. It's really difficult to see the global picture when you can't even put food on the table for yourself and your immediate family. And so these kind of arguments didn't really win him any support. And so it's in this that he kind of enters into the election in this kind of mood. This rather ominous mood is spreading really quickly as chronic unemployment is very deeply demoralizing. The New York Times described a Hoover Valley, which was a section of Central Park where you have essentially jobless people living in cardboard boxes or makeshift shacks made out of whatever they could find. The suicide rate soared. Violence was threatening even in some cities. A lot of farmers lost their lands due to tax delinquency. They essentially were foreclosed on. In 1931, Midwestern farmers organized a movement called the Farmers Holiday Association in order to force prices up by withholding grain and livestock from the market altogether. The most alarming protests came when a group of World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus that would be paid over a 20-year period. It had passed Congress in 1924, and in June of 1932, some 10,000 of these veterans, many of them jobless, went to Washington in order to lobby for the immediate payment of these bonuses. This group came to be known as the Bonus Army. Congress refused to pay them, and some of them went home, and others of them just sort of set up camp in their own kind of like Hooverville outside of Washington. About 2,000 of them did. Believing that they had some sort of malicious intent, Hoover called out the army to disperse them, and they did so with rather menacing efficiency. And that definitely didn't help Hoover's public image to see how he treated World War I veterans. The action sort of symbolized what many consider to be the administration's heartlessness. American writers also shared the sort of despairing mood as a lot of the things that come out speak to the sort of crumbling of American society. And you have some radical novelists who are openly attacking the capitalist system, and you get a kind of upsurge in more radical ideologies like communism during the 1930s as well. So in 1932, the Republican convention somewhat reluctantly renominates Hoover. The Democrats gather in Chicago and kind of smelled victory on the horizon for them following the rather disastrous policies of Hoover and his early response to the Depression. Their platform was crafted to ease party divisions that had sort of wreaked havoc for them in the 1920s and appealed to urban voters with a call to repeal prohibition, to farmers with support for their programs, fiscal conservatives with demands for a balanced budget and spending cuts. They ultimately rejected Al Smith, who was the rather controversial candidate in 1928, and instead nominated New York's Governor Franklin Roosevelt, who had had some success with his sort of New York State programs to deal with the Depression. His campaign offered very few specifics, however. He called for bold and persistent experimentation, which basically means I have no idea what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something different from what this guy's doing. And people bought into that. He also pretty generously attacked Hoover's reckless spending and insisted that only as a last resort should Washington play a larger Depression-fighting role, which is an interesting assertion considering that his schemes, which ultimately helped to get us out of the Depression, include an extremely large role for Washington. Unlike Hoover, he was supremely confident. He was sort of smiling and charismatic and energetic, and he was basically just not Hoover. And pretty much anybody who ran against Hoover had a good chance of winning this election, actually. He carried every state in the Union except for Pennsylvania and 4 states in New England, and both houses of Congress went heavily Democratic in 1932 as well. And it sets Roosevelt up to pass a boatload of legislation that we see making up the New Deal and that we will talk about in the next lecture.